The monolith should not have been there. Vane Sarada noticed it on the third pass of the orbital survey, a vertical line on the plateau that did not match the geological profile of anything within 1,000 kilometers. The plateau itself was basalt, ancient flood basalt from a volcanic epoch that had ended before most species in the Accord had developed written language. Flat, wind-scoured, featureless. The kind of terrain that survey teams marked as geologically stable, biologically inert. No further investigation recommended, and moved on from without a second look. But there was a line on the plateau, perfectly vertical, 12 meters tall according to the orbital rangefinder, with a radar cross-section that suggested a material denser than anything the planet's crust should have produced. Vane flagged it, tagged the coordinates, and requested a ground team. The request was denied. Survey Director Kethais, a Moravi with 40 years of tenure and the institutional patience of someone who had outlasted 6 changes in Accord survey policy, reviewed the flag and returned it with a single annotation: geological anomaly, probable volcanic extrusion, schedule for automated sampling next quarter. Vane stared at the annotation for 11 seconds. He was a Thanari, and Thanari did not argue with directors the way some species did, with raised voices and appeals to urgency. The Thanari way was quieter. He filed the annotation, acknowledged the directive, and then spent his off-shift hours running the radar data through every geological filter in the survey database. None of them matched. Volcanic extrusions did not produce right angles. They did not produce surfaces with a radar reflectivity coefficient of 0.97, which indicated a material so smooth that electromagnetic waves bounced off it like light off polished glass. They did not produce objects with a consistent 12-meter height across every scan pass, with no variation for thermal expansion, no weathering profile, no erosion signature despite sitting on an exposed plateau where wind speeds averaged 90 kilometers per hour. On the 7th day of the survey, Vane took a shuttle to the surface. He did not request permission. He logged the flight as a calibration run for the shuttle's ground-penetrating sonar array, which was technically true because he intended to use the sonar. He just intended to use it on the monolith. The plateau was worse than the orbital data suggested. Wind hit the shuttle the moment it dropped below 300 meters, a lateral shear that required manual correction, and made the autopilot complain in the flat, affectless tone that the Nari engineers had programmed into every warning system, because emotional urgency in a machine voice was considered aesthetically offensive. Vane corrected, landed, and sat in the pilot's seat for a full minute, watching dust stream past the canopy in horizontal, sheets the color of dried blood. The monolith was 400 meters from the landing site. He could see it through the canopy, a black vertical stroke against the pale sky, utterly still in the wind that bent everything else on the plateau. Not swaying, not vibrating, not accumulating dust on its windward face. Just standing there, the way a word stands in a sentence, fixed and deliberate and refusing to be anything other than what it was. Vane sealed his environment suit and stepped out. The wind was immediate and physical, pressing against his suit with a force that required him to lean into it at a 15-degree angle. His species was built for this kind of work. The Nari were dense-boned, low-centered, with a physiology shaped by a homeworld where the gravity was half again what most Accord species considered comfortable. He did not stumble. He walked toward the monolith the way he walked toward everything that interested him, steadily, without hurry, cataloging details as they resolved from the general into the specific. At 300 meters, the monolith was a shape, black, vertical, with edges that caught the pale sunlight and held it in lines so sharp they looked cut with a blade. At 200 meters, it was a surface, smooth, seamless, without joint or seam or any indication that it had been assembled from components. It looked carved from a single piece of material, except that no natural process carved 12-meter slabs with this precision, and no species in the Accord's archaeological record had demonstrated the capacity to work stone at this scale without leaving tool marks. At 100 meters, Vane stopped. Something was wrong with the surface. Not wrong in the sense of damaged, wrong in the sense of active. The black material was not static. Under the pale sunlight, faint patterns moved across its face, so subtle that he could not tell whether they were real or artifacts of the wind-driven dust refracting light at odd angles. He adjusted the magnification on his visor and watched. They were real. Geometric patterns, moving across the surface of the monolith like currents moving under the surface of dark water. Not random, structured, repeating at intervals that his trained eye, 23 years of field archaeology across 9 worlds, recognized as intentional. The patterns had the cadence of language, the rhythmic repetition and variation that distinguished communication from noise. The monolith was displaying something. Vane approached to 50 meters and activated his suit's recording array. 3 spectral cameras, a LiDAR mapper, an acoustic sensor, a magnetic field detector, and the ground-penetrating sonar that was his official reason for being here. The data began streaming to the shuttle's storage banks, and he watched the readout scroll across the inside of his visor, while the wind tried to push him sideways. The magnetic field readings were the first anomaly. The monolith was generating a field. Not a strong one, not the kind of field that would show up on an orbital scan, but a field with a structure so precise that the detector rendered it as a perfect toroidal shape, a donut of invisible force centered on the monolith's midpoint. No geological process produced toroidal magnetic fields. No known technology in the Accord's database produced one this stable at this scale. The LiDAR mapper returned the second anomaly. The monolith's surface was not flat. At millimeter resolution, it was covered in geometric depressions, each one precisely 2 millimeters deep, each one a different shape, arranged in rows and columns that covered every face of the structure from base to apex. Tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands. A density of deliberate marking that exceeded anything in the Accord's archaeological record by orders of magnitude. They were glyphs. Vane was looking at the most extensively inscribed artifact he had ever encountered, and he had encountered artifacts on 9 worlds across a career that had produced 31 published papers and a reputation as the Venari Survey Corps' most careful field recorder. He moved to 30 meters. The glyphs were clearer here, and the moving patterns he had seen from a distance resolved into something he could describe. The glyphs were illuminating, one at a time in sequences, the depressions filling with a pale light that was not reflected sunlight but something generated from within the material itself. Each glyph lit for approximately 2 seconds, then faded, and the next in sequence lit, and the next, the pattern moving across the face of the monolith like text being read aloud by someone who wanted to make sure every word was heard. Vane stood 30 meters from the monolith and watched it speak to no one. He recorded for 47 minutes. In that time, the pattern completed 3 full cycles across the visible face, each cycle identical to the last, a message on repeat. A signal that had been transmitting, based on the erosion profile of the plateau and the depth of the dust accumulation around the monolith's base, for somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years. 20,000 years. When this monolith began its signal, the Venari had not yet developed spaceflight. The Morevi had not yet unified their continental governments. The Accord itself was 3,000 years from being founded. And this thing had been standing on a dead plateau on a planet that no species had bothered to survey, until the Accord's expansion protocols reached this sector 8 months ago, sending its message into the wind, patient and precise, and utterly indifferent to whether anyone was listening. Vane returned to the shuttle. He sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the monolith through the canopy for a long time. In 23 years of field archaeology, he had excavated structures built by 11 different species. He had pulled Moravi temple shards from riverbed sediment, catalogued Brevari navigation markers on desert moons, and once spent 4 months reconstructing a Kethalan boundary archive from fragments so small he had needed molecular adhesion tools to handle them. He understood the vocabulary of ruin. He knew the difference between a structure that had fallen and a structure that had been abandoned, between a wall that had crumbled under geological stress and a wall that had been deliberately dismantled by hands that no longer wanted it to stand. He knew what decay looked like when it had been working on a surface for 100 years, 1,000, 10,000. This monolith showed no decay. None. In 20,000 years of wind and dust and thermal cycling, the surface had not pitted, had not cracked, had not lost a single glyph to erosion. Whatever material it was made of, it was engineered to outlast the forces that shaped the geology around it. The plateau was younger than the monolith. The basalt had come and gone and weathered and reformed, and the monolith had stood through all of it, broadcasting its signal, as indifferent to geological time as a lighthouse is to the tide. He transmitted his data to the survey ship in a compressed burst, tagged it with the highest priority code his clearance level permitted, and wrote a 3-line summary. Object is artificial. Object is actively signaling. Object predates all known Accord archaeological records by a minimum of 10,000 years. Director Kethais responded in 6 minutes. The annotation was different this time. Approved for extended ground investigation. A full archaeological team will be dispatched. Do not approach the object closer than your current minimum distance until the team arrives. This is a directive. The team arrived in 2 days. 7 specialists, pulled from 3 different survey ships, with equipment that filled 2 cargo shuttles and included a portable field laboratory, a deep scan resonance array that could image the internal structure of solid objects to a depth of 30 meters, and a linguistic analysis suite that contained the Accord's complete database of known scripts, living and dead, spanning 12,000 species and 41,000 years of recorded history. Vane watched them set up from the edge of the work perimeter, a 100-meter exclusion zone that the team leader, a Sorathi named Drenna who had a reputation for methodical caution that bordered on paralysis, had established around the monolith before allowing anyone to unpack a single instrument. The first day was scanning. Vane stood at the perimeter and watched the specialists work with the methodical efficiency of people who had been trained to treat every unknown object as both a discovery and a potential hazard. Drenna had assigned roles: Pren on acoustic and electromagnetic monitoring, Harith on materials analysis, 2 Brevari technicians on the deep scan array, a Moravi data archivist to maintain the chain of evidence log, and a Venari medical officer who spent most of the day watching Vane's baseline telemetry readings and calibrating the instruments that would monitor his vitals if he was ever allowed closer. No one was allowed closer. Drenna enforced the 100-meter exclusion zone with the kind of institutional authority that did not require raising her voice. She simply stated it once, and the team organized around it the way water organizes around a stone in a stream. The deep scan resonance array painted the monolith's interior in cross-section, and the image that assembled on the field lab's displays stopped every conversation in the tent. The monolith was not solid. It was hollow, or rather, it contained structure. Internal chambers, connected by channels so fine they were barely visible at the array's resolution, arranged in a 3-dimensional pattern that reminded Vane, with a visceral jolt of recognition, of the neural architecture diagrams he had studied in his university xenobiology courses. The monolith had something inside it that looked like a brain. Not a biological brain, not circuits or processors in any configuration the team recognized, but a network of channels and chambers that branched and connected and folded back on themselves, with the same recursive complexity that characterized neural tissue in every sentient species the Accord had ever catalogued. Drenna stared at the cross-section for a long time. She was Sorathi, which meant her emotional responses were subtle by the standards of most Accord species, but Vane had worked with Sorathi before and could read the signs. The slight widening of the inner eyelid, the stillness of the manipulator arms, the way her cranial plates locked into the configuration her species used when processing information that did not fit existing categories. "It's not in the database," she said. "Nothing in the database has internal structure like this." "It's a neural analog," said Vane. "The branching pattern, the recursive folding, the ratio of chamber volume to channel diameter. It matches the universal characteristics of neural tissue across every sentient species we've documented." "You're saying it thinks." "I'm saying it has the physical architecture for processing information in a way that resembles thought. Whether it is thinking now, whether it has ever thought, whether thinking is even the correct frame for what it does, I have no idea." The linguistic analysis suite returned its results on the second day. The glyphs on the monolith's surface did not match any script in the Accord's database. Not a partial match, not a statistical resemblance, not a shared character set with divergent grammar. 0 matches across 41,000 years of recorded linguistic history. The glyphs were something entirely new or entirely old, a script that had been developed by a species the Accord had never encountered, in a time period the Accord had no records for. The team spent 3 more days on passive analysis. Spectral imaging of the surface material revealed a composition that was not stone, not metal, not ceramic, not polymer, not any hybrid of known material classes. It was something else, a substance with a crystalline microstructure so dense and so precisely ordered that the spectral analyzer flagged it as possibly engineered at the molecular level, and then appended a note that this assessment exceeded its confidence parameters. On the 4th day, Drenna ordered the ground-penetrating sonar aimed at the base of the monolith. The image that returned showed roots, not biological roots, not pipes or cables, but branching extensions of the monolith's internal neural analog network, reaching down into the plateau bedrock in fractal patterns that extended beyond the sonar's 30-meter depth limit. The monolith was not sitting on the plateau. It was growing from it. Or more precisely, it had been planted in it, the way a post is planted in the ground, with subsurface anchoring structures that exceeded the visible mass of the object by an unknown factor. The implications of that finding produced the first genuine argument Vane had witnessed among xenoarchaeologists of this caliber. Drenna maintained that the root structures indicated a construction method, that someone had drilled into the bedrock and inserted the monolith from above. Pren suggested the opposite, that the monolith had been built from below, assembled in situ from materials synthesized in the planet's crust. A Thenari geologist named Harith, who had been brought in specifically for materials analysis, proposed a third possibility that silenced the tent for 10 seconds. The monolith and the plateau were the same age. The basalt flood that had created the plateau, some 300 million years ago, had somehow incorporated the monolith's material into its flow, or the material had been present before the flood and had survived it, and the plateau had formed around it the way coral forms around a piling. 300 million years. The number sat in the field lab like a weight. If Harith was right, the monolith was not merely older than the Accord's records. It was older than most of the geological features on worlds the Accord considered ancient. It was older than the evolutionary lineage that had produced the Thenari. It was older than the clade of oxygen-breathing carbon-based life that included every sentient species in the Accord's database. Harith was not certain he was right. He was certain he could not prove he was wrong. On the 6th day, Vane asked Drenna for permission to approach. "No," she said, "we don't have enough data to assess risk. We have 6 days of passive data that shows 0 hostility indicators. No radiation, no electromagnetic weaponry signatures, no chemical outgassing, no thermal anomalies beyond the glyph illumination. It's been sitting on this plateau for 20,000 years without harming anything. That's an argument from negative evidence. The absence of detected hostility is not evidence of safety. With respect, Director, it's been broadcasting for 20,000 years. If we wait for certainty before approaching, we may wait another 20,000. Drenna's cranial plates shifted, the Sorathi configuration for acknowledging a point while not conceding the argument. You have the densest bone structure on the team. If the object is hazardous, you are statistically most likely to survive initial exposure. That is not a comforting basis for approval. It was not meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate. You have permission. Maintain suit telemetry at all times. If your vitals deviate beyond baseline parameters, I am pulling you back. Vane walked toward the monolith. At 20 meters, the glyphs changed. The repeating cycle that had been running for 6 days, the same pattern he had recorded on his first visit, broke. New glyphs appeared, ones that had not been in any previous cycle, illuminating in rapid succession across the face of the monolith. The pale light brightened, shifting from the cool blue-white it had maintained to something warmer, a deep amber that pulsed with a rhythm Vane felt in his chest before he consciously registered it. Vane, Drenna's voice in his earpiece was flat and controlled. The monolith's magnetic field just doubled in intensity. The toroidal structure is expanding. It's responding to your approach. I see it. The glyph pattern has changed. I recommend you stop. Vane stopped. He stood at 20 meters and watched the new glyph cycle. They were different from the previous ones in a way he could identify but not yet articulate. Larger, more complex. The 2-millimeter depressions were deeper here, and the light that filled them was brighter, and the sequencing was faster, as if the monolith had shifted from idle to active, from broadcast to conversation. The acoustic sensor is picking up something, said Pren, the team's signals specialist, a young Moravi who had been quiet for most of the survey and was now speaking with the careful precision of someone who did not want to be misheard. Subaudible, a harmonic in the 7 to 12 Hz range. It's resonating with the plateau bedrock. The whole plateau is vibrating. Can you characterize the pattern? Drenna asked. It's structured. It's not random vibration. There are repeating units with variable intervals. It looks like it could be a secondary channel, audio frequency encoding in the bedrock, synchronized with the visual glyph display. The monolith is transmitting on 2 channels simultaneously. At minimum, there could be others we're not detecting. Vane took another step forward. The glyphs brightened again. At 15 meters, a new phenomenon began. The surface of the monolith started producing light from areas between the glyphs, a soft, even luminescence that outlined the monolith's edges in amber, making it look less like an object and more like a doorway, a vertical threshold between the dusty plateau and something else, something behind the surface that was not visible but was undeniably present. The wind died, not gradually, not in gusts. The wind that had been hitting Vane at 90 kilometers per hour since he stepped off the shuttle simply stopped, as if the air around the monolith had decided to hold its breath. The silence that followed was so complete that Vane could hear his own heartbeat through his suit's audio dampeners. And underneath it, just at the threshold of perception, the subaudible harmonic that was vibrating through the plateau and up through the soles of his boots and into his dense thenari bones. He took another step, 12 meters, close enough now to see the individual glyphs at their full resolution, each one a distinct geometric construction of lines and curves and angles that were simultaneously alien and achingly familiar. The way a word in an unknown language could still feel like a word, could still carry the unmistakable shape of intentional meaning even when the meaning itself remained locked. The monolith's surface was warm. He could feel the thermal radiation through his suit's sensors, a gentle heat that had no business emanating from an object that had been sitting in wind-driven cold for millennia. The heat pulsed with the same rhythm as the amber light, and the rhythm matched his heartbeat, and he realized with a start that sent a cold line down his spine that the match was not coincidence. The monolith was synchronizing with him. It was reading his biorhythm and matching it, the way a musician matches tempo, the way a speaker matches cadence to hold a listener's attention. "Vane, your heart rate just dropped to resting baseline," Drenna said. "Your cortisol levels are decreasing. The monolith's magnetic field is in training with your cardiac rhythm." "I feel it," he said. "It's not threatening. It feels like being listened to." "That is not a clinical assessment." "No, it's an accurate one." Behind him at the field camp, Harith was running the spectral feed from Vane's suit cameras through the materials database for the 11th time. His voice came through the comm, quieter than the others, carrying the particular weight of a scientist confronting data that invalidated his career's foundational assumptions. "The light it's generating, the amber emission. I've been analyzing the spectral profile. It doesn't match any known luminescence mechanism. Not bioluminescence, not electroluminescence, not thermal radiation. The photons are being produced by a process we don't have a category for. We would need to invent new physics to explain what this surface is doing." "Or old physics," Pren said. "Physics from before ours." No one answered that. The silence on the channel had the texture of 7 professionals arriving at the same conclusion independently and not wanting to be the first to say it aloud. He took another step, 10 meters. The amber light was everywhere now, coating the monolith in a warm glow that made the black surface look less like stone and more like deep water, reflective and alive and containing depths that the eye could not penetrate. The glyphs were cycling faster, the sequences becoming more complex, layering on top of each other in patterns that his archaeological training recognized as acceleration. The monolith was not just responding to his presence, it was escalating, building towards something. "I'm going to touch it," he said. "Absolutely not," said Drenna. "Director, this object has been waiting 20,000 years for someone to approach it. It changed its behavior when I crossed the 20-meter threshold. It's synchronizing with my cardiac rhythm. Every indicator suggests it was designed for contact. We can scan it for another 6 months and learn nothing more than we know now, or I can do what it was built for." Silence on the comm. Then Pren's voice, quieter than before. "Director, the subaudible harmonic has shifted. The repeating units are getting shorter. The intervals are compressing. If I had to characterize it in behavioral terms, I would say the monolith is anticipating." Drenna said nothing for 8 seconds. Then, "Maintain telemetry. If I say withdraw, you withdraw, non-negotiable." Vane covered the last 10 meters in 12 steps. Up close, the monolith's surface was not smooth. It was textured at a scale so fine that his naked eye could barely resolve it. A fractal pattern of ridges and valleys that repeated at every magnification level, each ridge carrying its own subset of glyphs, the inscription extending down into the material's microstructure, as if the message had been written not just on the surface, but through the surface, embedded in the molecular architecture of the substance itself. He raised his hand. The glyphs nearest his fingertips flared, amber light flooding the depressions and spilling across the surface in rivers of luminescence that converged on the point where his hand hovered. The monolith was reaching back. Vane pressed his palm flat against the surface. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The amber light held steady, the glyphs continued their accelerating cycle, and the monolith's surface was warm and smooth under his glove. He could feel its texture through the suit's haptic sensors, the fractal ridges pressing against his palm like the grain of very old wood. And he had the fleeting, irrational thought that he was touching something that had been waiting to be touched the way a door waits to be opened, with the full structural patience of an object that exists for a single purpose, and does not mind how long the purpose takes to arrive. Then the glyphs stopped. Every one of them. Simultaneously. The entire surface of the monolith went dark, and for 2 heartbeats the slab was just black stone standing on a plateau, inert and silent and indistinguishable from the geological anomaly Director Kethais had originally classified it as. Vane, every reading just flatlined, Drenna said. Magnetic field 0. Acoustic emission 0, thermal output dropping. What did you? The monolith ignited. Not the individual glyph-by-glyph illumination of the previous displays. The entire surface blazed with amber light, every glyph firing at once in a single sustained burst that was so bright it overwhelmed Vane's visor compensation, and he had to shut his eyes against it. The light was not painful, but it was total, filling his visual field with warm gold that pulsed once, twice, 3 times, each pulse synchronizing with his heartbeat, and then the light entered him, not through his eyes, through his hand, through the palm pressed flat against the surface, through the haptic sensors and the suit material and the skin beneath, into the dense thenari bone and the nerve bundles and the circulatory system and the brain that sat in its armored cranial vault, and suddenly, without warning or transition, began receiving information it had not asked for. The world changed. Not the world around him, the world inside him. The world of assumptions and categories and frameworks that he had spent 23 years building, the professional architecture of a field archaeologist who had excavated on 9 worlds and published 31 papers, and believed, with the quiet confidence of expertise, that he understood the basic shape of galactic history. The monolith gave him that history. Not in words, not in images, not in any sensory modality he had a name for. In structure. It gave him the framework, the architecture, the underlying pattern that connected every artifact he had ever cataloged, every ruin he had ever mapped, every fragment of ancient technology he had ever pulled from the dirt of a dozen worlds and tried to place in the context of the civilizations that had produced them. The framework was not what he had believed. He saw the Accord's timeline, the standard model of galactic history that every survey team carried in their database, the 41,000 years of recorded civilization that began with the Moravi's first written records and extended forward through the founding of the Accord, through the discovery of faster-than-light travel, through the slow expansion that had brought survey teams to this planet. He saw it the way a child sees a drawing they once believed was a complete picture, before someone turns on the lights and reveals that the drawing was made on a wall, and the wall is part of a building, and the building stands in a city that extends beyond the horizon in every direction. 41,000 years, the Accord's complete history. The sum total of everything the 217 member species had collectively recorded, debated, preserved, and taught to their children as the full story of civilization in the galactic arm. The monolith showed him what had come before. Not 41,000 years before, not 100,000, millions. An epic so vast that the Accord's entire history fit inside it the way a single sentence fits inside a library, present but insignificant, a recent footnote appended to a text that had been written and revised and rewritten across spans of time that made geological ages feel brief. And at the center of that epoch, at the origin point of the framework the monolith was showing him, was a species, not the Nari, not Moravi, not Sorathi, not any of the 217 species, whose names and histories and genetic lineages Vane could recite from memory. Something else. The monolith showed him their work, not their faces, not their bodies, not their cities or their ships or their governments. Their work, the things they had built, and the things they had built were not temples or monuments or weapons or ships. They were structures of information, architectures of organized knowledge so vast and so precisely constructed that the monolith itself, This 12-meter slab of engineered matter that had been standing on a dead plateau for 20,000 years broadcasting a message into the wind was a footnote, a signpost, a single word in a sentence that spanned the galaxy. They had built the conditions for intelligence. Not intelligence itself, not the minds that would later arise in the Nari skulls and Moravi neural clusters and Sorathi cognitive lattices. The conditions, the environmental parameters, the chemical gradients, the electromagnetic resonance patterns, the gravitational harmonics that created the precise, vanishingly unlikely circumstances in which complex neural tissue could form. On world after world after world, across the entire galactic arm, they had reached into the fundamental physics of planetary development and adjusted, subtly, precisely, with an engineering precision that operated at scales the Accord's best physicists would not have believed possible, the parameters that determined whether a world would produce thinking creatures or remain a ball of rock and water and mindless chemistry. Every sentient species in the Accord owed its existence to them, not because they had designed those species, not because they had engineered DNA or sculpted brain architecture or predetermined the course of evolution, because they had made evolution possible. They had turned a galaxy of dead probability into a garden of living potential, and then they had stepped back and waited to see what would grow. The monolith showed him specifics, not abstractions, not metaphors, not the broad strokes of a creation myth, engineering specifics. A world in a young solar system where the ocean chemistry was trending toward a particular sulfur balance that would prevent complex cellular membranes from forming, and a team of the builders, working across 3 generations of their short lives, adjusting the mineral composition of a single volcanic vent by fractions of a percent until the sulfur balance tipped, and the ocean around that vent began producing the membranes that would, 400 million years later, become the cellular architecture of the Venari nervous system, Vane's nervous system. The cells firing in his brain at this very moment, processing the information the monolith was giving him, were the distant descendants of a chemistry that had been nudged into existence by hands that had known exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway, despite knowing they would never live to see the result. They had done this on hundreds of worlds, thousands, each intervention different, each one calibrated to the specific conditions of that world, each one requiring a depth of understanding of planetary chemistry and evolutionary dynamics that exceeded anything the Accord's best scientists had achieved by orders of magnitude. And every intervention was subtle. Not the heavy hand of a god reshaping clay, but the careful touch of a gardener adjusting the pH of soil, knowing that the adjustment would propagate through the ecosystem across geological time and produce, eventually, conditions in which something might choose to grow. Might not would. The builders had not guaranteed outcomes. They had not designed species or predetermined evolutionary paths. They had made growth possible and then accepted that growth might not occur, that any given world might fail, that the sulfur balance might shift back, that the volcanic vent might go extinct, that a meteor might sterilize the surface before the chemistry had time to develop. They had accepted uncertainty the way a farmer accepts weather, as the price of planting. And then they had fallen silent. The monolith showed him the silence, not as an event, not as a catastrophe, not as a war or a plague or a collapse, as a choice. The builders had completed their work, and when the work was done, they had looked at what they had made, and they had decided that the best thing they could do for the garden they had planted was to leave it alone, to stop tending, to stop adjusting, to let the things that grew in the conditions they had created find their own shapes, make their own mistakes, build their own histories without the shadow of a gardener standing over them. They had chosen silence the way a parent chooses to let a child walk without holding their hand, not because they did not care, because caring, past a certain point, became interference. And interference was the one thing their work could not survive. The monolith released him, not abruptly, not with a snap or a severing. Gradually, the way a tide releases a swimmer when it has carried them as far as the current runs. The information flow tapered, thinned, became a trickle and then a warmth, and then a residual hum that settled into the back of his mind like the afterglow of a bright light behind closed eyes. The amber glow on the monolith's surface softened from blinding to steady to the baseline pulse it had maintained for 20,000 years. The fractal ridges under his palm went cool. The wind returned. It came in from the northwest, the same direction it had been blowing all week, and it hit his suit with the familiar pressure he had been leaning into since he first set foot on this plateau. But it felt different now. The wind was a product of atmospheric circulation patterns that had been shaped, he now understood, by the same hands that had shaped the chemistry, that had shaped the evolution, that had produced the nervous system, that was currently trying to process more information than any Thanari brain had ever been asked to hold. Vane was on his knees. He did not remember falling. His suit telemetry showed a 2-minute gap during which his heart rate had dropped to 34 beats per minute, his cortisol levels had flatlined, and his neural activity had spiked to a level that the medical sensors flagged as consistent with peak cognitive engagement or seizure. He was not seizing. He was processing. Vane, Drenna's voice was sharp. The Sorathi had abandoned her characteristic calm, and the word came through his earpiece with an urgency that cut through the fog of what he had just experienced. "Report your status." "I'm here," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rougher and quieter than usual, as if something in his throat had been wrung out. "I'm intact. The monolith showed me something." "Showed you what?" He tried to answer. The framework the monolith had given him was not the kind of information that reduced to a sentence. It was not a fact or a date or a name. It was a shape, a structure of understanding that changed the meaning of everything he already knew without changing any of the individual pieces. Every artifact he had ever cataloged was the same artifact it had always been. Every ruin was the same ruin. But the context had shifted, and in the new context, the Accord's entire 41,000-year history was not the story. It was the epilogue. "The builders," he said, "the ones who made this, they're not in our records. They predate our records by millions of years. They engineered the conditions for sentient life across the galactic arm, every species in the Accord. The Thanari, the Morevi, the Sorathi, all of them, all of us. We exist because they built the parameters that made us possible." Silence on the comm. Then Vane, the subaudible harmonic has stopped. The monolith's magnetic field is contracting back to baseline. The glyph cycle has returned to the original repeating pattern. Whatever it did, it's finished. But it was not finished. Vane could feel it in the way his hand still tingled where it had touched the surface, in the way the amber light was slowly dimming but not extinguishing, settling into a steady pulse that was no longer synchronized with his heartbeat but was holding a new rhythm, slower and deeper, as if the monolith had shifted from speaking to waiting. Waiting for the question it knew he would ask. Vane stood. His knees were unsteady, and the Thanari part of him, the part shaped by a high-gravity homeworld where unsteadiness was a failing that got you hurt, resented the weakness. He locked his joints and faced the monolith. "Who were they?" he asked aloud. The question was not for the team, it was for the object. The monolith answered. Not immediately. For 5 seconds that felt like 50, the surface remained in its steady baseline pulse, the repeating glyph cycle running unchanged. And Vane had the sinking thought that the object had delivered its payload and was done with him, that the question had been asked and ignored, that whatever intelligence operated inside those neural analog channels had decided that the information it carried did not include the identity of its builders. Then the baseline cycle stopped. Every glyph on the monolith's surface went dark simultaneously, the way every light in a building goes dark when the main breaker trips. The amber light vanished. The magnetic field, according to Drenna's sharp intake of breath on the comm, dropped to 0. For 3 heartbeats the monolith was dead stone. Then a single glyph ignited at the center of the monolith's face, larger than any of the others, occupying a space that had been blank during every previous scan. The glyph was complex, layered, a construction of lines within lines that built upward from its base like a structure being assembled in real time, each layer adding meaning the way each floor of a building added height. It was not a word in the way Vane understood words. It was a designation, a compressed identity that carried within its geometry everything the monolith had shown him, the epic of building, the precision of the work, the silence that followed. And alongside the glyph, arriving in his mind with the same sourceless clarity as before, a translation. Not words in his language, not sounds, not concepts mapped to the Nari grammar. A meaning, pure and direct, settling into his understanding the way a key settles into a lock. The builders had come from a world that orbited a yellow star on the inner edge of a spiral arm, a world of water and stone and improbable atmospheric chemistry that had produced, against staggering odds, a species that looked at the night sky and asked why, and then spent millions of years building the answer. They were small, fragile, short-lived by the standards of most accord species, their individual spans measured in decades rather than centuries. They compensated for their brevity with an intensity that the monolith conveyed as a kind of burning, a refusal to accept that the shortness of a life was a limitation on the scale of what that life could build. They worked in generations, each one handing the next a set of tools slightly better than the ones they had inherited, the slow accumulation of capacity that turned a species of mortal, breakable, frighteningly temporary individuals into something that could reshape the conditions of existence across a galaxy. They had given themselves a name in their own language, that the glyph rendered as a concept rather than a sound. The concept was layered, recursive, containing within it the ideas of soil, of building, of continuation, of the particular stubbornness of a living thing that refuses to stop reaching toward light even when the light is impossibly far away. And the monolith gave him another name, their name for what they had done, their name for the silence they had chosen, for the act of building a garden and then walking away so the garden could believe it had grown on its own. The glyph burned with amber light, and the translation arrived, and Vane felt the words settle into him like stones dropping into deep water, each one finding its place at the bottom and staying there, permanent, immovable, rewriting the sedimented layers of everything he thought he knew about the shape of history and the origin of his own species, and the reason a monolith stood on a dead plateau on a world no one had bothered to visit until 8 months ago. Architect of the long silence. That was what they called themselves, not builders though they had built, not creators though they had created the conditions from which creation sprang, architects of the long silence, the ones who designed the quiet, the ones who understood that the greatest act of engineering was not the construction but the restraint that followed, the discipline to build something vast and then refuse to sign it, refuse to claim it, refuse to stand over it, and say this is mine and you owe me for it. They had given the galaxy sentience, and then made themselves invisible so the galaxy could believe sentience was its own invention. Vane felt the weight of that in his bones, in the dense Thanari skeleton that was itself a product of their work, shaped by gravity on a world whose continental tectonics had been nudged, billions of years ago, to produce the higher gravity environment that would select for denser bone and lower centers of mass, and the stubborn, immovable patience that his species considered their defining characteristic. Even his patience was theirs. Even the quality that had brought him to this plateau, the inability to let go of a discrepancy, the methodical refusal to accept a classification that did not fit the data, was a trait that had been cultivated by the conditions they had engineered, propagated through billions of years of evolutionary selection on a world they had tuned like an instrument. He was not their creation. He was their grandchild, the great-great-great-grandchild, separated by so many generations that the number lost meaning, of a set of conditions that had been arranged with care by people who would never know his name, but had worked to make his existence possible. And the monolith, this single remaining signpost, had been waiting here for 20,000 years, cycling its message into the wind, maintaining the architecture of its neural analog interior against the slow erosion of time, for the moment when someone walked close enough to receive what it had been built to carry. Not the history. The monolith had given him the history, but the history was not the payload. The payload was the question that came after the history, the question that the architects had known would arise in the mind of whoever touched the monolith and received its contents, the question that was itself, the reason the monolith existed. Now that you know, what will you do? The monolith was not asking him to worship them. It was not asking him to find them or to thank them or to build monuments in their honor. It was not asking for anything. It was presenting a choice, the same choice the architects had faced when their work was done, to speak or to remain silent, to claim the knowledge or to release it, to use what he now knew as leverage, as power, as a tool for reshaping the political and philosophical landscape of the Accord, or to treat it the way the architects had treated their own work. As a gift, unsigned, unclaimed, given freely with no expectation of return. Vane stood on the plateau with his hand tingling and his knees aching and the wind starting to pick up again, the monolith's local calm dissipating as the amber light dimmed to its baseline pulse. Behind him, the field camp was alive with activity, every sensor recording, every specialist watching their displays, the full weight of the Accord's archaeological apparatus trained on a 12-meter slab of engineered matter that had just rewritten the origin story of every sentient species in the galaxy. He could feel the team's attention through the comm channel, the held breaths and the unasked questions, and the specific quality of silence that meant everyone was waiting for him to say something that would make sense of what they had just witnessed. Drenna's vital sign monitor on his feed. Pren's acoustic readings froze in mid-analysis. The other 5 specialists standing at their stations, watching the monolith through magnified lenses and spectral filters, and the naked disbelief of professionals confronting data that did not fit any model they had been trained to use. He thought about the architects. He thought about a species that had lived in decades and built across millions of years, that had engineered the conditions for thought itself and then walked away without leaving their name. He thought about the word they had chosen for what they did, architect of the long silence, not a title of pride, a description of discipline, the discipline to build the most important thing in the history of the galaxy and then shut up about it. He thought about his career, 23 years of careful work, 31 published papers, 9 worlds, every one of them now recontextualized, every artifact he had ever cataloged now carrying a secondary meaning he could feel but could not yet articulate. The Kethalan boundary stones that he had spent 4 months reassembling were not just territorial markers. They were the cultural expressions of a species whose capacity for spatial reasoning had been seeded by the architect's adjustments to the electromagnetic resonance patterns of their homeworld's crust. The Morevi temple shards were not just religious artifacts. They were the liturgical products of a species whose spiritual impulse had arisen from neural architectures that the architect's chemical interventions had made possible. Everything he had ever studied was evidence. It had always been evidence. He had simply not known what it was evidence of. He thought about what a lesser species would have done: monuments, temples. A galactic empire built on the debt of creation, with every sentient species in the arm paying tribute to the ones who made their existence possible. The architects could have had that. They could have been gods. They had chosen instead to be gardeners who trusted their garden, and the garden had grown, and the garden did not know it had been planted, and the monolith on this dead plateau was the only remaining evidence that planting had ever occurred. Except it was not the only evidence. The monolith had shown him that too, in the final moments of contact, A map rendered not in coordinates but in resonance patterns, a way of sensing the other signposts scattered across the galactic arm, each one a monolith or its equivalent, each one carrying the same payload, each one waiting on its own dead plateau or ocean floor or mountain peak for the moment when someone walked close enough to listen. Hundreds of them, across hundreds of worlds. A network of silence maintained for 20,000 years, each node broadcasting its patient signal into the indifferent cosmos, and until today, not a single one had been heard. Not because no one had come close enough. The Accord had surveyed thousands of worlds. Teams like Vane's had walked across plateaus and descended into caves and scanned mountains and mapped ocean floors on planet after planet. The monoliths had been there, had been standing in their places, had been cycling their signals, and no one had noticed because the signals were not designed to be noticed. They were designed to be found by someone who was looking, not looking for monoliths, looking for things that did not fit, looking for the anomaly in the data that everyone else marked as geological and moved on from. Looking the way Vane had looked on his 7th day when he took a shuttle to the surface, because the numbers did not add up and he could not stop thinking about them. The architects had not left their signposts for the brilliant or the powerful or the chosen. They had left them for the stubborn, for the ones who could not let go of a discrepancy, for the ones who filed the directive, acknowledged the annotation, and then spent their off-shift hours running the data through every filter in the database because something was wrong and they needed to know what. Vane understood, standing on the plateau with the wind returning and the amber light fading and his colleagues waiting for him to speak, that the architects had built the monolith for him. Not for him specifically, not for a Venari survey archaeologist with dense bones and a reputation for careful documentation. For anyone like him, for the type, for the pattern of mind that could not leave an anomaly unexamined, that treated discrepancies not as inconveniences to be filed away, but as invitations to be followed, that would take a shuttle to a dead plateau in defiance of a director's annotation, because the vertical line on the scan did not match the geological profile, and that fact mattered more than protocol. The architects had been that type themselves. They had looked at a galaxy of dead probability and said, "This does not have to be the way it is." And they had spent millions of years proving themselves right. And then they had walked away because proving yourself right was not the point. The garden was the point. The garden and the things that would grow in it, and the questions those things would someday ask when they found the signposts the gardeners had left behind. "Vane," Drenna said. Her voice was quiet now, the urgency replaced by something he recognized from his own emotional register as the sound of someone who had arrived at the edge of a category they did not have and was waiting for someone else to build it. "What did it show you?" He looked at the monolith. The amber light pulsed, once, slow and deep, and in the pulse he felt the resonance of every other monolith on every other world across the arm, each one burning with its patient signal, each one waiting, each one holding a piece of a story that was too large to fit in any single mind but could be assembled, piece by piece, signpost by signpost, by a civilization that was willing to do the work. "Everything," he said. "It showed me everything." He paused. The word was inadequate. Everything was what people said when they did not have the vocabulary for the specific thing that had happened to them, and Vane was a man who valued specific vocabulary. He had spent his career finding the precise word for the precise observation, the difference between a foundation and a substructure, between a deliberate fill and an accidental deposition, between a tool mark and a stress fracture. But the monolith had given him something that existed in no lexicon he knew, in no framework his training had built. He tried again. The wind gusted, carrying a plume of red dust between him and the monolith, and for a moment the amber glow filtered through the dust and turned it to gold, a curtain of light that hung in the air for 2 seconds before the wind tore it apart. The species that built this, They're not in our records because they did not want to be in our records. They built the conditions for sentient life across the galactic arm. Every species in the Accord exists because of what they did. They could have been remembered as gods. Instead, they chose to be forgotten because they understood that the greatest gift is one the receiver never knows they received. Silence. 12 seconds of it, the kind of silence that occurs when a group of professionals simultaneously arrives at the limit of what their training has prepared them for, and discovers that beyond that limit there is only awe. Pren spoke first. The subaudible harmonic, the one in the bedrock. I've been analyzing the pattern. It matches. It matches the resonance frequency of the Nari neural tissue. Not exactly, not perfectly, but within the tolerance range that would indicate the signal was calibrated for a Nari listener. Or for any neural tissue in the density range. It's a contact protocol. The monolith was designed to interface with whatever sentient species found it first. Not whatever species, Vane said. Whatever individual. The monolith wasn't waiting for a Nari or a Morevi or a Sorathi. It was waiting for someone who would walk across a plateau in 90 km/h wind because the radar cross-section didn't match the geological profile. It was waiting for someone who couldn't let go of a discrepancy. That's you, Pren said. That's any of us. Any of us on any world in any species. The architects built these things for the type, not the individual. They knew what kind of mind would find them because they were that kind of mind themselves. The monolith pulsed. Amber light, steady and warm, cycling through its original pattern again, the repeating message it had been broadcasting for 20,000 years. But the message was different now, in Vane's perception, because he could read it. Not the glyphs, not the language, but the intent. The monolith was not saying, "Look at what we built." It was saying, "Look at what you are. You are the thing we built the conditions for. You are the thought that arose in the garden we planted. You are the question we knew the garden would eventually ask, and the monolith is not the answer. The monolith is the proof that the question was worth asking." Vane turned to face the field camp. 7 specialists, standing at the edge of their exclusion zone, watching him. Drenna with her cranial plates locked in the assessment configuration. Pren with his recorder running. 5 others whose names he knew and whose careers were about to be redefined by what had happened on this plateau. "We need to contact the Accord Central Archive," he said, "and the Linguistic Conservancy and the Geological Survey and every archaeological department on every world with a survey team in the field. This is not one monolith. There are hundreds, across the arm, and every one of them is carrying the same message." "What message?" Drenna asked. Harith spoke from the lab tent, his voice carrying the specific timbre of a geologist whose entire career had just been recontextualized. "The basalt, the flood basalt that formed this plateau. I've been running the mineral composition against the standard for volcanic rock in this system. There are trace elements that shouldn't be present, rare earths in ratios that no natural volcanic process produces. I flagged them on the first day and assumed instrument error. They're not instrument errors, they're signatures. The same signatures I've seen on 6 other worlds in my career and dismissed every time as anomalous." He paused. The plateau wasn't natural either. None of them were. Drenna's cranial plates unlocked from their assessment configuration and shifted to something Vane had never seen a Sorathi produce. The full open state, every plate at maximum separation, the configuration their species reserved for moments when the cognitive load exceeded the capacity of any single processing mode, and the brain needed every channel available. She was not analyzing. She was absorbing. "Director," Pren said, "the other monoliths, if there are hundreds of them and each one is broadcasting the way this one broadcasts, then we have been surveying worlds with active alien signposts for decades. Every survey team in the Accord, every planet we've mapped, we walked past them. We classified them as geological anomalies and moved on. Because they were designed to be walked past, Vane said. By everyone except the one who couldn't. Vane looked back at the monolith. The amber light pulsed, patient and warm and utterly indifferent to the wind that was starting to howl across the plateau again, the red dust streaming past its surface without touching it, the pale sky stretching overhead in an arc that contained, somewhere in its vastness, the yellow star the architects had orbited, the world they had walked on, the civilization they had built and then deliberately, lovingly, painstakingly erased so that the galaxy they had given sentience to could look at itself in the mirror and see not a debt but a gift. That we are not alone, he said. That we were never alone, and that the ones who made sure we would not be alone chose to be silent so we could hear ourselves.